Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. Subscribe for more interesting videos. Thank you. Here is the story begins. David Cole had grown used to entering rooms where every glance measured him like a man under a microscope, but that did not mean it ever felt natural. Success had taken him from the rust-stained streets of Pittsburgh to the penthouses of Manhattan, yet the memory of soot and sweat still clung to his bones. He was the son of Marcus Cole, a steel worker whose back had been under furnaces, whose callous hands carried the dignity of labor, but whose voice had been ignored by men in tailored suits. From childhood, David had sworn that his life would not echo his father's silent humiliations. That vow had driven him into a relentless pursuit of excellence. By 38, he was the founder and CEO of Cole Tech Innovations, a company that had turned obscure algorithms into a revolution in artificial intelligence. Fortune magazine had placed him on its cover. Forbes had called him the new architect of industry, and venture capitalists whispered his name with reverence. Yet every accolade carried an invisible asterisk. The question of whether the world would truly allow a black man from Steeltown poverty to sit at the highest table without demanding some cost his pride. It was Henry Lawson, his oldest ally and lawyer, who slid the embossed envelope across the polished oak of David's office table. The invitation was thick, the script elegant, and the seal heavy with old money arrogance. David turned it over, reading aloud the words he had suspected would appear one day. The Winthrop Foundation requests your presence at their annual gala. Discussion of future partnerships to follow. He set the card down and looked at Henry. "You know what this means," Henry said quietly. His voice, graveled by years of courtroom battles, carried no excitement. "It means," David replied, "they finally decided I'm worth more as a partner than as a competitor." The Winthrops were not merely rich. They were wealth's aristocracy, a family whose influence stretched from oil to railroads to politics. Their fortune had shaped laws, built skyscrapers, and whispered in the ears of presidents. For decades, they had swallowed or crushed every rising rival who threatened their dominion. That they now extended a hand to David suggested not benevolence but calculation. His company had developed proprietary learning systems too advanced for them to replicate. A merger was worth billions. But Henry's frown deepened. "David, you know what their circles are like. They don't forget bloodlines. They don't forget skin. I don't need their approval," David said, "just their recognition that I've built something they can't." In the silence that followed, he could hear his father's voice echoing from decades earlier, the night Marcus had come home in his soot-stained overalls after a 12-hour shift. David had been 14, eager, dreaming aloud about becoming an engineer. His father had crouched in front of him, eyes red from heat and exhaustion. "Never let a man buy your pride, son. He can buy your labor, he can buy your invention, but the day he buys your pride, you're not his partner, you're his property." That warning had never left him. Now the invitation demanded a test of it. Over the following week, David prepared as though entering battle. He reviewed every detail of the proposed deal. $1 billion in investment for a 51% stake in Cole Tech. On paper, it looked like salvation for rapid expansion. In practice, it was an attempt at ownership. He rehearsed answers for inevitable insults, measured his words as if they were currency, and reminded himself that his presence at the gala was not merely about business. It was about declaring that he belonged, without apology, among men who had long believed otherwise. The night before the event, Henry called him again. "You could walk away," he said. "You don't need them. Investors would line up tomorrow if they knew you were open." David stood by his window, the city's neon lights painting his reflection in shades of defiance. "Maybe I don't need them," he admitted, "but they need me, and I want them to see that with their own eyes." The following evening, his car pulled into the circular drive of the Winthrop estate. The mansion loomed like a fortress of marble, every column a monument to money that had never known hunger. Valets rushed forward and journalists clustered behind velvet ropes, cameras flashing at every notable arrival. David stepped out, tall and composed, his black tuxedo cut to perfection. Whispers rippled through the crowd, admiration, skepticism, curiosity. But he kept his gaze fixed ahead, the rhythm of his heartbeat steady against the tide of judgment. Inside, chandeliers spilled light across polished floors, and champagne flowed like water. Men with inherited titles shook hands with senators. Women in diamond necklaces glanced at him with quick, assessing eyes. He could feel the invisible weight of being the singular figure who did not belong by their unspoken rules. Yet he moved through the room with measured calm, nodding when necessary, smiling when expected. Each step was an act of defiance, each gesture a refusal to shrink. At the far end of the hall, Richard Winthrop awaited. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, his presence radiated the confidence of a man unaccustomed to denial. Beside him stood his eldest son Alexander, tall and sharp-jawed, eyes glittering with a pride bordering on contempt. "Mr. Cole," Richard greeted, extending a hand. "We are pleased you accepted our invitation. Tonight may mark the beginning of a very prosperous future." David shook the hand firmly, his own grip unyielding. "Prosperity," he replied, "is always mutual. I'm here to ensure it's also fair." A flicker passed over Alexander's expression. Amusement, disdain, or perhaps both. David felt it like the first tremor before a storm. The orchestra swelled, the gala glittered, and conversations were around them. But David knew that beneath the champagne smiles and polished etiquette, the true confrontation was only beginning. And somewhere deep inside, he recognized that the evening would test not the strength of his company, but the worth of his dignity. The orchestra played a sweeping waltz that seemed to suspend time in the glittering air, but David Cole knew that beneath the melody lurked calculation. Every smile in the room carried the sharp edge of strategy. Every handshake lingered just long enough to measure status. He moved with calm precision, scanning faces, absorbing whispers, refusing to let his posture betray the unease rippling under his skin. He was not a guest here. He was a specimen on display. Henry Lawson, never far from his side, leaned closer as they navigated the clusters of financiers and senators. "Keep your voice steady, your words measured. They'll try to provoke you." His tone was low, but his eyes never stopped tracking the men who circled like hawks. David gave a slight nod. "Let them. I didn't come here to cower." The Winthrop patriarch, Richard, soon signaled for his guests to join him near the raised dais where the evening's announcements would later take place. His silver hair gleamed beneath the chandeliers, his tuxedo crisp, his smile carrying both courtesy and condescension. "Mr. Cole," he began with practiced warmth, "our family admires achievement, especially when born from nothing. Ambition, after all, is the lifeblood of enterprise." David studied him, hearing the compliment but also the undertone that reduced his journey to novelty. "Ambition without discipline collapses," David replied evenly. "Cole Tech thrives because we build on structure, not luck." Before Richard could respond, his eldest son, Alexander, stepped forward, glass of scotch in hand, his eyes narrow with a faint glimmer of disdain. Tall, with features sculpted into perpetual superiority, Alexander carried the air of a man who believed the world his inheritance. "Cole Tech," he said, almost spitting the syllables. "A curious enterprise. Clever machines teaching themselves clever tricks. Yet no matter how many billions you pile up, culture and pedigree are not things algorithms can code." The words carried a ripple through the nearby guests. Some smiled politely, others glanced away, but all leaned closer for the sport of tension. David's jaw tightened, though his expression remained composed. "Pedigree may open doors, Mr. Winthrop, but innovation builds a future, and the future doesn't wait for anyone's bloodline." Henry's eyes flicked nervously between them, sensing the air thicken. Richard chuckled, as though diffusing the exchange, but his amusement was hollow. "We are not here to debate lineage, gentlemen," he said smoothly. "We are here to discuss opportunity. The proposed merger could transform your company into a titan. Imagine the reach, the resources, the markets unlocked." $1 billion for control," David replied. "That's not partnership, it's conquest." The older man's smile faltered slightly. "Control is merely stewardship. Our family has guided industry for generations. We refine what others create. You would retain a role, of course, but the true helm, well, some responsibilities require experience." David caught the glance exchanged between father and son, a silent dismissal of his worth. Heat coiled inside him, but he forced his voice to remain level. "Experience without vision breeds stagnation. Coal Tech was not built to be a footnote under another family's banner. The conversation drew onlookers, forming a subtle ring of wealth and curiosity. Waiters froze mid-step. Guests leaned in, and even the orchestra seemed to lower its volume. David could feel every eye on him, the only black man in a hall of polished ivory faces. He had endured such scrutiny before, but tonight it burned more keenly. Alexander lifted his glass, his smirk widening. "Tell me, Mr. Cole," he said loudly enough for the ring of guests to hear, "do you ever wonder if you belong here at all? Surrounded by men who were bred for this life, who understand legacy not as something clawed from the dirt, but inherited, preserved, exalted." David's silence was deliberate, calculated, but Alexander mistook it for hesitation. He stepped closer, his voice dripping with venomous amusement. "Your kind can build machines, I grant you that. But building empires? That takes heritage. That takes class. And you, for all your brilliance, will always be," he paused, letting the words hang like a blade before the crowd, "a visitor at someone else's table." The insult echoed, cruel in its clarity. Henry stiffened beside David. But before he could intervene, Alexander made his fatal gesture. With a sudden, disdainful swing, he struck David across the face with the back of his hand. The sound cracked through the ballroom, louder than the orchestra, louder than the murmurs. It silenced everything. Glasses froze midway to lips. Breath caught. The chandeliers themselves seemed to shudder. David did not stagger, though the sting seared across his cheek. His body went still, every muscle coiled with controlled fury. For a long, endless second, no one moved. Cameras from the press at the back of the hall caught the moment, flashes sparking like lightning against the marble walls. Alexander straightened, smug in his triumph, certain humiliation would force submission. Richard's eyes darted nervously around the room, torn between scolding his son and maintaining the family's dominance. The gathered crowd waited, some aghast, others thrilled by the spectacle. Henry whispered, barely audible, "Don't give them what they want." David slowly raised his head, his gaze sweeping the room. The fury in his eyes was tempered by something stronger, resolve. He could feel his father's voice inside him, the old words like iron in his blood. "Never let a man buy your pride." The gala had become more than a business deal. It was a crucible. He touched his cheek once, not in weakness, but as if marking the moment, burning it into memory. Then, with a steadiness that unsettled the silence, he looked directly at Alexander and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall. "You've just written the story of tonight, and I promise you it won't end the way you think." The guests shifted, murmurs swelling, the promise of scandal hovering in the air. Richard tried to laugh it off, to smooth the crack in the evening's facade, but the damage had already been done. David Cole had been struck in the House of Wealth, in front of their witnesses, and his response to decide not only the fate of the billion-dollar deal, but the dignity of everything he represented. For a moment, David Cole stood motionless, his cheek burning, the echo of Alexander Winthrop's hand still reverberating through the vast marble hall. Around him, the air carried the strange weight of collective silence, an expectant hush born of shock, amusement, and disbelief. Men in tailored suits leaned forward slightly, eager for spectacle, while jeweled women covered their mouths with gloved hands, savoring the scandal even as a pretended dismay. Every gaze fixed on David, not out of empathy, but out of curiosity. Would he yield to humiliation, or would he break the unwritten rule of such gatherings and resist? Henry Lawson's voice slipped into the quiet, like a thread of reason. "David," he murmured, low and urgent, "let it go. The deal's too important. We can address this later, privately." His hand hovered near David's arm, not daring to touch but desperate to steady him. David did not answer. His mind had slipped into memory, back to a steel mill where he had once carried his father's lunch as a boy. He remembered Marcus Cole standing before a foreman who had cursed and demeaned him in front of others. His father's eyes had burned that day, but Marcus had lowered his head for the sake of wages, for the sake of survival. That night, at the kitchen table, Marcus had told him the words that never left his soul. "Son, I took a spit because you needed to eat. But if the day comes when you have your own bread, never let a man treat you as less. To bow when you have a choice is to sell your very self." The recollection ignited something deep within him. He had bread now, more than bread. He had power, earned through brilliance and sacrifice. And yet here he stood, tested in the cruelest theater. Slowly, David stepped forward, breaking the ring of silence. His voice, when it came, was steady, resonant, carrying across the chandeliers and polished floors. "Gentlemen, ladies," he began, each syllable deliberate, "what you just witnessed is not about me. It is about the sickness that still lingers in rooms like this, cloaked in elegance but rotting underneath. A man raised with every privilege believed he could strike another man and face no consequence. That is not heritage. That is cowardice dressed in silk." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some straightened, offended by his audacity. Others leaned in, captivated. Alexander sneered, his voice sharp. "You think a speech will save you? You think these people will side with you?" David turned his gaze directly on him, eyes burning with controlled fury. "I don't need them to side with me. I need them to hear me, and they will remember every word long after the champagne runs dry." He moved to the dais, his hand closing around the microphone meant for Richard Winthrop's keynote. The billionaire patriarch rose in protest, but the room's hunger for drama overpowered etiquette. No one stopped David as he stepped on the platform, framed by the golden glow of chandeliers, the slap still visible as a faint mark across his cheek. "My company was built from nothing," he said, voice rising with conviction. "Not inherited wealth, not political favors, not bloodlines stretching back to monarchs. It was built with work, with sleepless nights, with the belief that ideas matter more than pedigrees. Tonight, I was offered $1 billion. $1 billion in exchange for control, for dominance, for the chance to call me talented, but keep me tethered. And when I did not bend quickly enough, I was reminded, physically, that in some minds, a man like me does not belong here." The murmurs grew louder, the audience torn between indignation and awe. Henry stood at the edge of the crowd, chest swelling with pride he dared not show too openly. David held up the sleek black folder containing the contract, its embossed lettering gleaming under the light. He opened it slowly, the papers crisp, the $1 billion promise inked within. For a long moment he stared at it, the weight of decision pressing against his chest. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Then, with steady hands, he tore the contract in half. The sound of ripping paper was louder than the orchestra had ever been, sharper than Alexander's slap, final as a gavel strike. Piece by piece, he shredded the document until nothing but fragments remained, scattering them across the polished floor. Gasps burst from the crowd, a collective intake of disbelief. Alexander's face flushed crimson. "You fool! Do you know what you just thrown away?" David met his glare without flinching. "I threw away a leash. I will not be bought. Not by you, not by your family, not by anyone who believes respect is optional." Richard's composure cracked at last, his voice raised with an anger rare for a man who usually whispered commands and saw them obeyed. "You will regret this. We make kings and we unmake them. Don't think for a moment you can survive without us." David descended the dais, his steps unhurried, his presence unshaken. He paused only once, turning back to face the entire hall. "You mistake yourself for gods," he said calmly. "But your power is borrowed, temporary. Men like me will build futures you can't control. And when history writes this night, it will not remember your wealth. It will remember your arrogance and my refusal to bow to it." The silence that followed was no longer the silence of expectation, but the silence of reckoning. Every guest understood they had witnessed not just a scandal, but a turning point. Cameras had captured everything. The slap, the speech, the tearing of the contract. By morning, the world would know. Henry moved to his side as David strode toward the grand doors. He began, but words failed him. David gave the faintest smile, grim yet resolute. That was necessary. As the heavy doors swung open, cool night air rushed in, breaking the suffocating atmosphere of the gala. David walked out without looking back, leaving behind a glittering prison of chandeliers and old money, his dignity intact and his path irrevocably changed. The Winthrop family remained frozen in the hall, caught between fury and disbelief. the shredded remains of their billion-dollar offer littering the floor like ashes. The guests whispered, debated, and speculated, but none could deny the truth. David Cole had not only walked out on their deal, he had shattered the illusion of their untouchable dominion. And as the doors closed behind him, the night carried the promise that the story was far from finished. The night after the gala stretched into history before dawn. By morning, every news outlet replayed the same images. Alexander Winthrop's hand arcing through the air, the sharp crack as it met David Cole's face, and then the calm, deliberate way David tore apart a billion-dollar contract in front of the astonished elite. Headlines flared with language both scandalous and reverent. Humiliation at the Winthrop Gala. Black CEO walks away from $1 billion deal. Integrity over wealth. The footage spread across every corner of the digital world, dissected by anchors, commentators, and ordinary citizens who saw in David not just a businessman, but a symbol of defiance. Cole Tech's headquarters became a fortress of flashing cameras and crowded microphones. Reporters camped outside, demanding statements, speculating on whether the company could survive without the Winthrop capital. Henry Lawson moved through the chaos with steady precision, parrying questions, drafting careful responses. But even he was astonished by the groundswell of support erupting worldwide. "You've struck something deeper than business," he told David quietly in his office, watching a television screen filled with protest signs and tweets carrying his name. People aren't just watching, they're rallying. David sat behind his desk, the same spot where the embossed invitation had first arrived. His cheeks still bore the faintest mark of Alexander's arrogance, but his eyes glimmered with a strange calm. "I didn't plan a movement," he said. "I just refused to bow." "That refusal," Henry replied, "has made you a banner." The Winthrops, meanwhile, scrambled. Richard issued statements attempting to downplay the incident, calling it a misunderstanding magnified by emotion. Alexander vanished from public view, his silence feeding the frenzy. But damage had been done. Stock prices in Winthrop-linked enterprises dipped, and politicians who had once sought the family's favor now distanced themselves. In hushed conversations behind closed doors, men who once believed the Winthrops untouchable began to whisper decline. For David, the consequences were immediate and severe. Some investors withdrew, fearful of offending the old dynasty. Offers of partnership evaporated overnight. For weeks, uncertainty loomed like a storm cloud, threatening to undo years of progress. Yet with every withdrawal came a new surge of unsolicited support. Independent entrepreneurs offering collaboration, international firms sending proposals, grassroots movements buying Cole Tech's products in waves. Integrity had become marketable, and David had become its face. Late one evening, alone in his office, David found himself gazing at a framed photograph of his father, Marcus, taken years before in soot and sweat, eyes weary yet proud. He imagined what his father might say now, if he could see the headlines, the marches, the chants of strangers in faraway cities shouting his son's name. Perhaps he would only nod, the way he once had after long days at the mill, as if to say, "You carried the weight further than I could." But victory carried a different weight, too. $1 billion had been torn to shreds, and while respect filled the void, the responsibility to sustain his company loomed larger than ever. David wrestled with doubt, alone in the silence. Was pride worth the risk of collapse? Could principle feed employees, fund innovation, secure a future? Henry found him there, staring into the shadows. "You're not asking the right question," he said softly. "It's not whether pride feeds people. It's whether surrender would have starved them of something far greater. They don't just work for Cole Tech's paycheck, David. They work for what you stand for. You gave them proof that dignity matters. That's worth more than $1 billion. The reassurance anchored him. In the following weeks, David channeled his energy into rebuilding with fire in his veins. He met with partners who respected him on his terms, declined offers wrapped in veiled condescension, and charted a course that valued independence over subservience. Each decision was harder, riskier, but each one carved deeper into the legacy he was determined to leave. Months later, he returned to Pittsburgh, drawn to the cemetery where Marcus rested. The winter air was sharp, the ground brittle with frost. David knelt before the grave, brushing away the snow that clung to the stone. "You told me never to sell my pride," he whispered, his voice catching. "I didn't, but the world is heavier now because of it." He closed his eyes, letting the silence of the place settle into his bones. "Still, I'd rather carry this weight than bow. I hope that's enough." When he rose, the city skyline stretched in the distance, steel towers gleaming like reminders of the past he had risen from. His phone buzzed with new opportunities. Partnerships abroad, investment from unexpected quarters. But he slipped it back into his pocket. For the moment, silence and memory mattered more than contracts and negotiations. The Winthropes never recovered the aura they once wielded. Alexander became a recluse, a symbol of arrogance undone. Richard fought to repair the family's empire, but the stain of scandal proved indelible. History, relentless in its verdict, remembered not their centuries of dominance, but the single night they tried to humiliate a man who would not bend. David Cole walked back into his company headquarters weeks later to a scene that felt more powerful than any deal could have bought. Hundreds of employees lined the lobby, their applause thunderous, their faces lit with admiration. Some held signs reading "Dignity First." Others simply clapped until the walls shook. David raised a hand, humbled, and for a rare moment, words failed him. Yet in that roar of voices, he understood. The billion-dollar deal had never been his true test. The test was whether he would honor his father's lesson, whether he would stand unbroken when the world demanded submission. He had chosen, and in choosing, he had not only saved his pride, he had ignited a fire in countless others who believed they too could refuse humiliation. As the applause echoed, David smiled faintly, the sound of steel mills and champagne halls both behind him now. He was not merely a man who had lost a deal. He was a man who had won something greater. The unshakable truth that wealth means nothing without respect, and that dignity, once guarded, becomes immortal.